I want to cross to Melbourne now to catch up with Tim Wilson, the member for Goldstein and a former Australian Human Rights Commissioner. Thanks for joining us, Tim. I'm pretty keen to get your thoughts on this push for a referendum on Indigenous recognition and possibly a voice, an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Are you surprised that this pledge from the government wasn't actually put through the coalition party room before it was announced?
Well, we've had a long-standing position around discussing the importance of a voice and a pathway through this debate, and I don't believe that the government's policy has changed. I just think that when you're actually dealing with it and somebody makes a speech about it, it rightly raises question marks when we haven't landed on a concrete proposal. And that's kind of the challenge that is before the minister and before the government, is coming up with a proposal that unites the Liberal Party room and the government and the Parliament, and also brings Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders along with the journey to make sure that we can unite the country, because that should be the focus of how we're going to deal with this discussion. But
it was the Labor Party who went to the election promising a referendum in this term of government, and yet yesterday Ken Wyatt, as the minister, made that pledge on behalf of the government. It's a significant policy pledge. And in order to make sure you do have a decent debate and unity within the government, shouldn't that have gone through the party room rather than to surprise Liberal MPs around the country? They find out about this by clicking on a website or watching Sky News?
Well, the position the Labor Party took at the last election was that they were going to have a referendum on a voice in Parliament in this term. What the minister has actually said is that he wants to have a referendum that deals with the issue. Now, it sounds like he's splitting hairs, but there's actually quite a big difference. The position of the government is not actually to just put forward a proposal or a voice in the Constitution, because people like myself who are very socially liberal but also very constitutionally conservative raise our eyebrows at that proposition, because we start from a position, and it doesn't matter what it is, that when you're dealing with the Constitution, that the default position is basically no change. Somebody can put forward a proposal which is we should make Tim Wilson Prime Minister of this country for life in the Constitution, and my default position would be no change, unless you can persuade me otherwise. When you're talking about legislative pathways for reform, for making sure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have substantive representation, and also make sure that they have a voice over the affairs of the issues that affect them, then I think there's a lot of goodwill out there.
Well, this is where it gets very contentious. I think Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, it's not as easy as it sounds, but there's pretty broad political support for doing that, at least in a minimalist way, a symbolic way. But the idea of enshrining a voice to Parliament in the Constitution is something that concerns even you, as you said, even someone as socially liberal as yourself.
Well, I say that from the position of every single constitutional change starts from that position. So it's not explicitly just about this proposal, but yes, including this proposal raises some eyebrows from myself as well. And so that's what we have to work through. And I think there is an enormous amount of goodwill, not just within the Liberal Party and the government, but across the Parliament, I think within the general community, about making sure we have substantive as well as symbolic improvement in the situation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, like with things like the change of gap statements, which are then benchmarked against real action improvement in people's lives. And I think that's where a lot of people want to see the discussion going, not just symbolic, though that's important, but substantive improvements to make sure that we can move as a nation forward together.
Exactly. Now, and obviously it makes sense when a federal government is legislating in areas of Indigenous affairs, as it has the constitutional power and responsibility to do, then obviously they get advice from Indigenous people. Now, they've done that with informal advisory councils under Labor and Liberal governments, and the idea of a voice is to basically enshrine that in either the constitutional legislation. It's not a particularly radical idea when you look at it from that perspective.
Well, I think any proposal to change the Constitution always needs to have its tyres kicked pretty comprehensively, because one of the things that, as I said, someone as socially liberal as me, but constitutionally conservative, is you never want courts to use a power that's in it to interpret another way. Most of us don't want race or any racial test sitting at the heart of the Constitution, and we also want to make sure that it's not going to create alternative consequences which haven't been fully considered. When you're talking about, and the point about the Constitution is, once it's changed, it not just can then be interpreted by courts, but is very hard to wind back if we get it wrong. Whereas legislation we can deal with on a day-to-day basis, and that's why people see such a stark difference between the two.
There's a lot of fear-mongering going on, though. For instance, there's this idea of people saying it's a warning about putting race into the Constitution. Well, actually, race is in the Constitution now.
Correct.
And part of this reform would be to get rid of some of those outdated references to race. And also, this is really about Indigenous ownership of land. It's less about race than a historic generational commitment to those who were here first. But
Chris, this is the fundamental point, which is I agree we want to get race out of the Constitution. And where people have concerns, and these are the sorts of things, and I say it with all goodwill, need to be worked out through the proposal. But if you then set up an alternative body which has a pseudo-racial test about who can participate, you actually aren't removing. And that's why there's a contradiction sometimes in the proposals that are being put out on what they want to achieve. These are the sorts of things that we need to work through, and we need to make sure we do it comprehensively, because if you don't, and I say as somebody who's seen the legal legitimacy of their own life in part put on a survey form for the judgment of my peers and fellow Australians, the only basis in which you do that is if you are absolutely confident that it is going to pass. And I don't believe that that confidence currently rests with some of the proposals that are before us today.
But this is the point. There's not a concrete proposal. It's worth discussing this, and no one is saying that this needs to be an elected body where only Indigenous Australians get to vote for people. There's all myriad of ways of having people appointed to an advisory body. You've got colleagues going out talking about a third chamber. Malcolm Turnbull did this, Tony Abbott did this, and others. They're raising this idea of a third chamber of Parliament. Now, no one has ever proposed that, and that is blatant fear-mongering, isn't it, to trying to kill off this idea with an exaggeration?
Well, the concern is that you're going to set up a body which is going to have direct input into Parliament, and that is definitely what was proposed. And that, some people have more of an input into the Parliament. Now, do I think this is a third chamber? My personal view is no, it's not. What it is, though, is a structure in our democracy which some people will be able to participate in that others won't. And this is the perennial challenge that sits at the heart of this debate is most Australians, I think, want one nation to move forward together, where we all see ourselves in equal dignity and worth. We know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have had a history of injustice in the past, and many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders want to preserve their culture and operate in part separately from the rest of the Australian population. So thinking this can be changed by just a couple of words in the Constitution has to be lived, it has to be accepted by the whole of the Australian community, but it also has to be considered pretty clearly about how we're going to balance some of those tensions if you actually want to get a pathway to reform.
But you can't pretend that these issues aren't there. There is the federal government's responsibility on Indigenous Affairs. That has to be there in order for the federal government to oversee Mabo native title legislation for starters. And the idea that Aboriginal people wouldn't have input and advisory input to that is absurd. And it's a gross exaggeration, and it's fear-mongering to call such an advisory body a third chamber of Parliament.
Well, advisory bodies already exist for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that provide input. I think what people are concerned about is the weight it would have if it's put in the Constitution rather than being dealt through some pathway of legislation. We used to have a body, as you will well recall, called ATSIC. Now, ATSIC had some pretty serious problems, mostly as a result of it being given the power to dole out money. And
exactly, so it's a completely different story. Yeah.
No, that's right. And so if you remove the money power and focus on the representative power, I think a voice to the nation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders would be a fundamental good. I actually think we're a poorer nation for lacking that voice to the nation. The question is the process and the capacity to be able to establish it, not whether I think people would accept there be a voice.
Yeah, and I think the key compromise here that you're focusing on and others will focus on is to do that through legislation rather than through the Constitution, and that's part of the debate that's going to unfold. Tell me on other matters that you'll have a keen interest on, religious freedom legislation. Do you think that there is signs of any sort of bipartisan support here, or is this issue going to descend into partisan bickering?
Well, we're not talking about a religious freedom bill. We're talking about a religious anti-discrimination bill. We have ones dealing with race, disability, gender and sex, sexual orientation. There isn't one covering religion. The Parliament's looked at this before and put it in the too hard basket. The government said we're going to take it out of the too hard basket and say that everybody should be protected sort of broadly from discrimination in the community. It's an incredibly complex area of law, because the first thing that many religious groups want under laws saying they don't want to be discriminated against is that they also need the freedom to be able to discriminate against others, because a test of religious worship is being able to associate with others. So I think this is going to be a very difficult one for the government to work through if the Labor Party is not going to play ball. It isn't clear yet what they're going to do. To be fair, they're looking through the legislative, or they haven't seen the legislative proposals, and the government is working through them at the moment. It's going to need a lot of input into stakeholders if we want to unite the country.
You've got a good insight on this, because you used to be an Australian Human Rights Commissioner, and there are many people in the political debate, especially on the coalition side, myself included at times, who have thought the best policy option here would be to abolish the Australian Human Rights Commission. Under this legislation, under this framework, as I understand it, religious discrimination would then be overseen by the Human Rights Commission. And rather than reducing its power, it keeps its race, its gender, its age discrimination powers, and has added to them religious discrimination powers.
That would be part of the proposal, based on what I'm aware of and what's in the
Does that worry you?
Public square.
As a former insider, does that worry you? You've seen how the Commission works.
I have seen how the Commission works, and this is a wicked area of law where nothing's straightforward. There's a proposal for a Freedom of Religion Commissioner. Now, I used to do the job of Freedom of Religion as being the Human Rights Commissioner. That was part of its job. So maybe it's my departure that's prompted this course of action. But it's a very complicated area of law, and that's going to be the challenge. My personal view, and it's always been, is that I'm reluctant to try and codify these issues in law. I think that freedom always should start as the default, and there should be the law's job should be then to come along and make the compelling case about why it needs to be infringed upon. We currently don't have an act. I'm concerned that when you take these issues from convention into codifying in law, it will turn into constant legal disputes rather than how a lot of these issues are worked out at the moment. So that's why we've got to get it right. And Christian Porter's doing a fantastic job under the stewardship of the Prime Minister to make sure that we do get it right.
Maybe the way to get it right, though, is to tear the whole edifice down rather than add to it.
That's your opinion, Chris. We didn't take that to the election, so I don't think that's a position that we'll share.
You might have won by more. You might have won by more.
Well, actually, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think people accept that the government has a job to do, and there's legislation there that reflects broadly communities' aspirations for the type of country we want to be. Now, you can have philosophical differences, and I've had my philosophical differences around anti-discrimination law before, and I don't hide from them. But I think most people want the law to treat everybody equally. They want Australians to be able to get on with their lives without, unnecessary discrimination. The question is, if we keep piling it on, is it going to achieve that purpose? And what is the extent of the law? I mean, I've been quite clear in the past. We've got Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. I oppose that section of the Act completely. If we were to introduce that into other areas of anti-discrimination law, you'd be, say, for instance, in religion, you'd end up with an anti-blasphemy law, something that I simply couldn't tolerate. So this is why it's slow, comprehensive consultation led by the AG. He's doing a great job with the PM to get everybody on the same page. So let's see where it ends up.
Tim Wilson, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
Tim Wilson there, who's got an insider's view of all of this, a very intelligent and insightful view of some of the pitfalls of this anti-discrimination area. But we are going to see soon some anti-religious discrimination legislation put up before the Parliament.